Hello, once again, this is Viper Bites, and this is another one of our primetime previews this week featuring the Buffalo Bills taking on the New England Patriots. After last week's 33-26 loss to the Minnesota Vikings, the New England Patriots, they find themselves on the outside looking in on that AFC playoff picture there. At 6-5, the Patriots trail both the 7-4 New York Jets and the 8-3 Buffalo Bills when it comes to booking a spot on Wildcard weekend. Currently, the Bills, they hold that fifth spot thanks to a 28-25 victory on Thanksgiving in Detroit. For the Patriots, this isn't necessarily a must-win game, but it's about as close as a must-win game as you can get here in week number 13. Considering the Jets, they play the Bears this week, and the 6-5 Chargers, they host the 4-7 Raiders. Now, before we dive into this tale of the tape here, let's talk about FantasyPoints.com. That is the true MVP when it comes to fantasy sports right now. You get your one-stop shop for all your fantasy football needs, and you sign up today using promo code 22Vipers10. That gets you 10% off your subscription and gets you in on that Discord channel with some of the brightest minds that fantasy sports has to offer. Now, speaking of MVPs, let's talk about the front runner here in the NFL with Josh Allen. You still cannot convince me that Josh Allen is close to 100% right now. Luckily for the Bills, Josh Allen at 80% is still a top 7 quarterback in this league. Against the Lions last week, a team that's allowing about 24 fantasy points per game this season, 2 quarterbacks, Allen finished with 30 fantasy points, but that was on the strength of 78 rushing yards, which also resulted in a score. Running the ball is something that the Bills likely want to see a little less of coming from Josh Allen there, as he is still dealing with that UCL injury in his throwing elbow. Allen may need to leave the pocket early and often this week as he takes on a Patriots team that currently sits second in the NFL in sacks with 37, thanks to a league-leading 13 coming from Matthew Judon. New England also boasts a secondary that has recorded 12 interceptions this season, which also has them ranked inside the top 4, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position over the last 4 games on a per-game basis there at 11.19. If Allen has time, we've seen what he can do, averaging 7.8 yards per attempt this season, and he sits second in passing yards with 3,183 and second in touchdown passes with 23, while adding 561 yards on the ground and 5 more scores. Now, on the other sideline there, we have Mac Jones, McCorkle Jones. You know I love myself the Mac attack. No one wanted to hear me out last week when I mentioned that Jones was in line for a good fantasy day against the Vikings secondary that was banged up, depleted, and missing starters. All he did was complete 28 of 39 passes for 382 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he did this all essentially with his best receiver unavailable for a significant portion of that contest. Jones comes into this week's contest having attempted 120 consecutive passes without an interception. If you recall, earlier in the season, Jones had thrown 7 interceptions in his first 5 contests of the season. Luckily for Jones, this Bills team hasn't had much success sacking the quarterback this season, something that has occurred 19 times in the last 4 contests that Jones has stepped in under center. And the loss of Von Miller for the Buffalo Bills means that Jones, he's going to have a little bit more time to progress through his reads this week. The last time that Jones faced this Bills defense, he was sacked on 3 occasions. That came in that AFC Wildcard round where he threw a pair of touchdowns, but he also threw a pair of picks. Now, Buffalo is hoping to get some pieces back on the defense this week, but so far this season, they are allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, allowing just 13.59, while picking off almost as many passes, 13, as they've allowed touchdowns, 14. Now, turning our attention to the backfield here, starting with the Bills duo there of Devin Singletary and James Cook. Now, we know that Devin Singletary there is the lead back in Buffalo, seeing all 12 opportunities on 3rd and 4th down, as well as all 5 snaps inside the 5-yard line last week. While Cook, he saw just 18% of the snaps compared to Singletary's 78%. Singletary manufactured 14 attempts on the ground into 72 yards, an average of 5.1 yards per carry for those who are keeping track. It also helps when you lead the league in red zone carries since week number 10, as Singletary and his 17 carries have done so, as he's also been responsible for 53% of the Bills' backfield touches in the red zone in the last month. Now, even last week, Singletary got multiple cracks inside the 10-yard line before ultimately it was Josh Allen time, who would end up punching it in for a score. You have to think that Buffalo will look to continue to limit Allen, if possible, in the run game, allocating more opportunities to Singletary. However, the carries are split up this week between James Cook and Devin Singletary. The Bills' backs are going to need to be efficient against a Patriots team that's allowing just 15.6 fantasy points per game to backs this season, which is the lowest in the league. And they've allowed just 2 touchdowns, 1 receiving and 1 rushing all season long. Over the last 4 weeks, they've been even better, allowing 164 yards total and no scores and a league-low 9.1 fantasy points per game. In the other backfield, the Patriots, they counter with Rhamondre Stevenson. Essentially, if you combine LeGarrette Blount and James White into one back, you get Rhamondre Stevenson. Take away what Stevenson has done on the ground the last half of the season so far, and you still get a receiver that has been more productive than someone like Mike Evans. Yeah, that's how good Stevenson has been in the passing game. Stevenson, against that Vikings team last week, he posted 46 rushing yards on 7 carries. Again, 5.1 yards per attempt and 76 yards on 9 receptions. It was the 3rd time this season that he has produced over 19.5 fantasy points without scoring a touchdown. That is key. That's huge. If you're scoring fantasy points without scoring touchdowns, I mean, that's pretty good staying power right there. Rhamondre Stevenson has been a man on a mission since week number 3. We know what he's capable of doing on the ground. 680 yards on 151 carries. Now, looking at his numbers in the passing game since week 3, Stevenson, he sits 2nd in target share at 22%, 3rd in receptions at 47, and 4th in targets at 55 amongst the running back position. Well, Buffalo has been good this season against opposing backs. The last 4 weeks, has been somewhat of a different story there, as they have struggled, allowing 4 touchdowns on the ground, along with 414 rushing yards there, along with 159 yards in the passing game. In fact, over the last 4 weeks, the Bills are allowing, on average, 26.1 fantasy points per game to the running back position, which is the 10th most. Damien Harris, he's already been ruled out for Thursday with that thigh injury, and his status moving forward looks to be week to week. Now, finally, the pass catchers in this contest, we have some good ones, starting with the Bills combination there of Stefon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, and Isaiah McKenzie. My man, Sandro, always speaking highly of the birthday breakout weeks. So when Stefon Diggs celebrated with friends and family on Tuesday, you better believe he will have his cake and eat it too in front of the world on Thursday. Diggs ranks 2nd in targets with 119, 2nd in receptions with 84, 3rd in touchdowns with 9, and in receiving yards with 1,110, with a shot at the Triple Crown well within his reach. Against the Lions last week, many fantasy managers, they were worried. I mean, there was cause for concern there, as Diggs only had 4.2 fantasy points through 3 quarters of that contest. The 4th quarter was a different story. When that came around, well, everyone started putting that fist in the air like, yeah, it's 4th quarter time. Diggs, he stepped up. Josh Allen, Stefon Diggs, they would go on to record 21.7 fantasy points together over the last 15 minutes. It should come to no one's surprise here that Diggs has been targeted on 29% of his routes this season, while seeing a 31.7% target share, which is 5th in the league, and 1,010 air yards, which is 4th. In the last month there, Diggs has a target share of 33.6%, and only 3 other receivers have a greater target share over that same period. Typically, when Allen isn't looking for Diggs, he is airing it out to Gabriel Davis, who sits 14th this season in air yards and sits 1st in ADOT with a minimum of 50 targets there, seeing an average depth of target somewhere around that 16-yard mark. Now, it was Isaiah McKenzie last week who had it going on there, hauling in 6 of 10 targets for 96 yards and a score. McKenzie's breakout game last season, it came against his very same Patriots defense. You know that game on Boxing Day, probably during your fantasy football playoffs, where he'd go out there and have 11 catches for 125 yards and a score. Prior to his 2022 production, that was really all that he had done. Now, he did that against the Patriots. And you know what? His 2nd best game of the season, it also came against the Patriots there in that AFC Wildcard round, where he'd go on to record 3 receptions for 45 yards. Now, back to Gabriel Davis. Look for Jalen Mills to match up for a solid portion of this contest. Davis has lined up on the left boundary 50% of his routes and 41% on the right side, while Mills has split his time 34% to the left and 52% to the right, but he has allowed 0.34 fantasy points per route run this season, which is something that the Bills could probably take advantage of in this contest. That all being said, this Patriots pass defense is as good as it gets. They have allowed the third fewest passing yards over the last 4 weeks, and throughout the season, they've been one of the stingiest when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the position, allowing the sixth fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks at 26.9. As for the Patriots pass catchers, it starts with Jakobi Meyers. Even an injury last week could not stop Jakobi Meyers. Technically, it did slow him down, but he still came away with 3 catches for 62 yards. So I'm calling that a small victory there after he injured his shoulder and would go on to just record 29% of a snap share. On the season, Meyers is commanding 25% of the air yards and a 19% target share so far. And let's be honest, it's really just him and Stevenson in this Patriots passing game. If Meyers is healthy, he draws Taron Johnson in the slot, who is allowing 0.35 fantasy points per route run this season. And considering how quickly Mac Jones has been getting that ball out of his hands, I'd expect that to be a matchup in which the Patriots look to exploit this week. Meyers currently leads his Patriots team in targets at 62 and in receiving yards at 571, and he is second on the team with 47 receptions, again, behind Rhamondre Stevenson. Meyers sits 16th in yards per route run this season and sits 24th in points per game in PPR formats. And it's like no one even wants to talk about him. Dang it, don't make me start pulling out receipts because you know I'm a huge Jakobi Meyers stan. Jakobi Meyers, he's got a couple other guys he's bringing to the party as well in Devontae Parker and Nelson Aguilar. Now, Parker, he has been working his way back into this lineup, and he returned last week, catching all 4 of his targets there for 80 yards, including that nice 40-yard passing catch midway through the third quarter of last week's contest. Now, Parker, he started this week being limited in practice, but on Tuesday, he was upgraded to full participation. As for Nelson Aguilar, he was thrust into the spotlight last week due to the injury to Jakobi Meyers' shoulder, accounting for 65 yards and a touchdown on 6 grabs. Now, Aguilar's participation this week really relies on the health or lack thereof of Jakobi Meyers. With Parker returning and a healthy Meyers, that kind of limits the fantasy production Aguilar may have. The Bills have been taking it on the chin in recent weeks, having allowed 762 receiving yards, which is the third most, and 6 touchdowns, which is the second most, to wide receivers. And they've allowed nearly 44 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. And for whatever reason, that is the most in the league, believe it or not. Now, tight end wise, we have Dawson Knox for the Buffalo Bills, and we have Jonas Smith and Hunter Henry for the New England Patriots. Last week, I thought Dawson Knox had a great matchup as he was facing a Lions team that is allowing almost 14 fantasy points per contest to opposing tight ends. He would go on to record just 17 receiving yards and 2 receptions. That all came after a career-high 7-catch performance against the Browns in week number 11 that included 70 yards. We have established that New England is one of the best defenses in fantasy when it comes to limiting both the running backs and receivers. However, when it comes to tight ends, that's another story there. So far on the season, the Patriots are allowing tight ends to average 13.5 fantasy points per contest, which happens to be the 8th most in the NFL. We thought the matchup was good last week. Didn't kind of work out that way. Think the matchup was great this way. You know what? I'm not even make a call on this one. Now, for Jonas Smith and Hunter Henry, 2 weeks ago, it was Jonas Smith who had 4 grabs for 40 yards against the Jets. So you're thinking, hey, you know what? Jonas Smith is starting to come around. Then last week, Hunter Henry, he would go on to score a touchdown there, posting 3 catches there and 63 yards, while Smith did absolutely nothing. Good luck trying to figure out who the primary tight end option is going to be this week. You know what? It doesn't even matter because Buffalo, they have done an excellent job of containing tight ends this season, having allowed less than 10 fantasy points per contest there at 9.75. Even if you wanted to start Smith or Henry, I would strongly recommend fading both of them, as the Bills this season have yet to yield a touchdown to the position. That all being said, again, head to fantasypoints.com today. Get that subscription. Use promo code 22Vipers10. Tell them Matt sent you, and we'll see you next week.